So, good evening, everybody. Good evening here in Europe, or hello when you're in other parts of the world. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to today's Reschool Bite. I would like to welcome you also in the name of my co-founder, Christina. We're very happy to have you here, and would also like to thank our sponsors, Fiction Express, ACW, EdStart, and Vima, who make the Reschool initiative possible. If you want to learn more about Reschool, our background, what we are doing every month, you can visit our website, re.school. There you find all information about upcoming events and also the reports of the previous events we have been doing. After each event, we're always publishing a report with the lessons learned and insights from that event. So please go to reschool.com to find all the information. If you want to share today's event in social media, please use the hashtag #RethinkingSchools. You can find us on Facebook. We are also streaming live on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And you find all videos of Reschool events in our YouTube channel, re.school. So let's get started. It's a great pleasure to welcome our speakers for today. After speaking with all of you, I have the feeling that today will be the most personal Reschool event we have been doing so far. As you will see, our speakers' insights are based on their personal experiences and stories. Without any doubt, teacher well-being is a very personal topic, and I'm delighted to have you with us, sharing your experiences openly. Beth Kerr is Group Director of Wellbeing at Cognita Schools and an experienced media commentator on teachers and students' well-being. In her role at Cognita Schools, Beth ensures that well-being leads to better academic results and character development. It is great having you with us, Beth. Welcome. Adrian Bethune is a part-time teacher in a primary school, education policy co-lead at the Mindfulness Initiative, and founder of Teachappy. He's the author of several books on teachers and students' well-being, amongst them Well-being in the Primary Classroom and Teacher Well-being and Self-Care. Welcome, Adrian. It's a true pleasure welcoming you. Our third guest is Dr. Emma Kell. Emma is a senior teaching fellow at the UCL's Institute of Education and a teaching school lead at Aspire Pupil Referral Unit in Buckinghamshire. She has a doctorate in teacher well-being and work-life balance and is author of How to Survive in Teaching and Teacher Well-being and Self-Care, which she co-authored with Adrian. Emma, thank you very much for sharing your story and experiences. Before we get started, we would like the teachers and head teachers in the audience to answer 3 short questions. Can we launch the the questions. First one, as a teacher, do you feel more stressed today than before the pandemic? Second, which aspects cause you the most stress? Please answer maximum 3 of the options. And third, do you feel sufficiently supported and prepared by your school to manage the current situation? And just give another 20 seconds and then we see the result. Okay, I think we can close. So do we feel more stressed today? 91% say yes. So that's obvious, but that's the context we are talking. Where do we struggle more? Work-life balance in these times, related to distance learning. And in the context of distance learning, I think class preparation is one of the big issues. And do you feel sufficiently supported and prepared by your school to manage the current situation? More than half say yes. This is very, very positive, but still almost 40% say no. And this after almost 1 year going through this situation. I think the numbers have been worse in our June event. We made a similar question there. So we're moving towards the right direction, but are not still there yet. Perfect. So then let's get started. COVID-19 has affected our personal and professional lives, but the impact on our teachers and academic staff has been particularly acute. Many teachers have felt defenseless, lacking the necessary guidance from their government and sometimes even receiving little support from their schools. We're getting better there, so this is good. Research for the 2020 Teacher Wellbeing Index provides an insight into the mental health and well-being of UK educational professionals. We take here the UK as an example, but the situation is similar in other countries and regions across the world. The stress levels remain high. 62% of education professionals describe themselves as stressed, being senior leaders the ones that experience the highest level of stress. There has been an increase in poor well-being symptoms such as difficulty of concentrating or insomnia. And the high workload is viewed as a critical factor in influencing staff retention. 52% of education professionals have recently considered leaving the profession due to pressures on their health and well-being. As we will discover through our panelists' personal stories, teacher well-being has always been a significant challenge, but going through a pandemic has made the challenge even more pressing and evident. Considering those data, during our discussion today, we would like to focus on 3 levels. First, how can education institutions improve the mental health and well-being of their teachers? Second, what can teachers do on their own and in cooperation with their colleagues to improve well-being? And third, what is needed from governments to support schools and teachers to improve the situation? To start our discussions on these fundamental questions, I would like to ask our speakers to share their initial thoughts. As first speaker, I would like to invite Beth for her opening statement. Please, Beth, go ahead. You can share your screen.
Thank you, Sven. Right, let me find my screen. I always get a bit nervous when these things, as they're going ahead. If you can let me know when you can see my screen, that would be great.
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, lovely. Well, thank you very much. It's really lovely to be here. And I'm particularly grateful to you for giving up your time, which is more precious than really it ever has been before. So I just want to cover a few things that I've outlined there. And I want to start first of all with the first one, which is you are a teacher plus. And that's really important place to start for me. You, I imagine, hold lots of identities. You are not just a teacher. You are also a son or a daughter. You're a parent, a grandparent, an auntie, a friend. You may be a gardener. You may be a yoga enthusiast. You may be a mother, a father, a grandparent. All of these roles that you have in your life have responsibilities, and they are also equally important and make up the whole of you. So at a time where we are so focused on our students and trying to help them and our families, it's really easy to forget that we also have these different roles that make us up, and they're really important to hold on to. So try to respect these, identify what these roles need as well, and don't feel guilty about revisiting and paying attention to those other roles you have in your life. And that may well need boundaries, and quite firm boundaries, and communicated boundaries with your colleagues at school, with your leadership team, about other roles and responsibilities that you have in your life that are valid. And when I say the word responsibility, I don't just mean the responsibility to your children, for example, which sometimes, you know, we sort of accept there is a socially acceptable responsibility, but you have a responsibility to yourself as well. So if gardening is something that you love doing because you know that's really good for you in all sorts of ways, then that's a really valid responsibility. So my first message really is just about respecting and revisiting and boundarying your other identities. The next part that I want to focus on is self-compassion, and we could sort of perhaps learn something from our young people here who tend to be, so let me just put this on, I'll put it on, is that better? Let me just, perfect. Sorry, just, yeah, sorry. Yes, so sometimes our young people are quite good at this, and they focus inwards, and they understand the things that they need to make their lives better. And often teachers are not quite as good at this. So when I talk about self-compassion, I want us to really just focus on those terms just for a little while. And we had a session this week with Dr. Hazel Harrison, who talked in more detail about this. And I really like the quote that is there, because it's not talking about, you know, chocolates and bubble baths, or, you know, wine and candles, which are all lovely and are really nice things to do. But it's about recognizing and understanding what it takes to be human, and really turning towards that suffering and recognizing what it looks like, what it feels like, and whether it's in yourself or other people, and then taking action to alleviate it. Now, when we look at self-compassion, we look at sort of, we can think about self-kindness, which are those sort of things like the chocolates and the bubble bath, which is nice and it's great, but it's not the same as self-compassion, and it can't exist without it, really. It's just layering over the cracks. So you absolutely need that real level of attention, paying attention to the things that make you human. The second one is about looking at sort of common humanity versus isolation. And I guess what I mean by that is that we are all imperfect. That's what makes us, that's what joins us together as people. And instead of always striving to be perfect, actually accepting that, you know, having flaws and vulnerabilities is what pulls us together. And it's not to be feel, you know, you shouldn't feel ashamed about feeling flawed. Otherwise, I would feel ashamed all the time if that was the case. But making mistakes, feeling vulnerable, feeling that is part of what makes us human, and part of our role as teachers to share that with each other and with our students. And then the first one is about that mindful, balanced approach to negativity. There is so much negativity there at the moment that it is quite difficult to be balanced. And some of the things that you have to do to get that balance may actually involve physically switching, tuning out of the news, you know, the government briefings that, well, I don't know about you, but invariably they leave me feeling frustrated, upset. Sometimes they're really traumatic if you're watching the news. And so sometimes it's just about you controlling what you can take in. So you just balance out that that negativity rather than over-identifying all those things. So if you could, if there's one thing you took from what I say today, is that reframing that self-compassion, not as something that is selfish, but actually that is something that is essential. So self-compassion is essential, not selfish, and it will make us better teachers in the long run as well. So if we were starting with well-being as in a school, I just thought it might be helpful to outline how a few steps of how we did this in a group, and how it could help in your school. So the first one was about having a common language. Well-being can mean different things to different people in different contexts, and language is different, and culture, of course. And so for us, deciding on our physical and mental contributors was really important. They do, of course, you know, cross over and have a symbiotic relationship with each other. But having that common definition was really useful, a good starting point. And there's just a little bit more detail about each one. I didn't pick these just out of thin air. They were based on evidence, and that's really important, because if you're trying to explain to students, to your staff, to yourself why these things are important, then you need the evidence and the science behind it. And teachers are wonderfully curious and questioning, and they need that to hand to actually justify why they should make some differences to their life to include these things. So having those definitions was really important for us as a starting point, and it also enabled and facilitated conversations to move things on. I thought it might be useful if I highlighted just by looking at sleep, and it was interesting that Sven mentioned the higher levels of insomnia, which is unsurprising during the pandemic. Now, there is so much evidence about sleep now that I just picked a few statistics and evidence and research there for you to look at. And the reason I picked a selection is because when you give evidence, some things will hit a nerve with some people and others will hit a nerve with others. And it has to be something that connects with you. So, for example, when I was fortunate enough to interview Professor Matthew Walker, and I remember him talking to me about the causal relationship between lack of sleep and Alzheimer's. And I remember coming off that interview and I rang my parents straight away and I said, you've got to get to sleep earlier. It's really important. It's really important. You really must, because I was explaining about this beta amyloid protein. I won't bore you with it now. But that really resonated with me, and there was a bit of a light bulb moment, and it switched for me, because I thought, well, I can cope with being, you know, a bit tired and drink a bit of coffee and I keep going and I'm just always on the go, as teachers are. But that is something that really bothers me, and then therefore I'm going to make changes. So looking at the science is important. When you're talking to different groups, you may well want to frame it at different age. Obviously, if you're talking to children, you wouldn't put quite so much detail in. If you're talking to certain teachers, you might want to put more detail in. But we started with that evidence and the science. And then we thought, right, this is going to be a strategic whole school or across our schools, in our case, plan. But it also is no good if it's not an individual plan. So we're really encouraging on appraisals or performance management, or however you describe those target setting processes that you go through. We were really encouraging our staff to look into how could they put, you know, sleeping better as an appraisal target, because the impact it has on your, you know, not just your well-being, but your performance, your health is so great. So it needs to be both things. If it's just the school and you're not taking any co-ownership of that, then it's not going to, you know, it won't go very far, because at the end of the day, you can't put people to bed and you can't help them sleep. You can just empower them. The second one was just about ask and keep asking. Sometimes school leaders and governments and teachers with the best will in the world think that something's a really great idea, and then they just crack on with it, and they haven't kept asking if that's helpful. So asking and keep asking about the things that we were producing. Were the interviews useful? Were sort of information for parents useful? Was it useful to do Q&As to help really embed that drip, drip, drip approach in? And then we looked at all these angles and how the whole community could contribute. And I've just given some examples there, about having an immersion day. We look at, in detail at sleep on World Sleep Day. But then we had toilets on the back of the door, just with a few little, those are some suggestions. We looked at parent contracts, making clear that, sending emails at 2 o'clock in the morning, that might not be something that, would help because of this sleep thing. So there were lots of things that we could do as a whole community and as an individual. So just quickly then to run through the culture of well-being. The dilemma is, the bottom line, and please don't take offense of this, but teachers are so brilliant at looking after their students' well-being. They are really not so brilliant at looking after their own well-being. And that's been my experience, at least working in individual schools, but also working across groups of schools all over the world. The good news is this is a common trend. I don't see any vast diversification from this statement, whether I'm in Asia or Latin America or Europe. You're all equally brilliant at looking after students and not so brilliant at looking after your own well-being. So the questions to ask regularly, and I talk about regularly because this is the sort of thing that needs to be on the agenda all of the time. What can I as a school leader do to support these contributors, the sleep, diet, exercise, connecting, doing, giving? You, of course, may choose slightly different ones for your context, but what can I do as well? These are some key themes that came up from Anna Freud about things that cause real stress and threats to well-being, and Sven picked on a few earlier. So I think if they were distributed to these 3 steps, the first is that intentional and strategic focus. It is not going to happen on its own. You're not going to sleepwalk into better well-being for your staff or for you individually. But the good news is that you can make big changes to it. The second one is about empowering, and that means, are you really creating an environment that is encouraging of well-being? Is it not just tokenistic? But really, you have to co-own it as an individual. You have to take that and co-own it yourself, and that might mean that you recognize, because of all this effort, information you've been given on sleep, for example, that your sleep is pretty poor, and then you recognize that one of the reasons is you're working until 11 o'clock at night. You have to take the steps, and it might be easy if you say to your boss, who's also online so late, I'm actually going to switch off at 8 o'clock at night now because I'm really struggling to sleep. So it's about you really co-owning that, as difficult as it might be, and I'm not undermining how difficult it is. And then finally, about measuring and monitoring, because if we don't keep checking in that we're on the right lines, we might be going down the wrong road. So there, just finally, you matter, and that's why I really hope that you get something out of this session to take away and improve your well-being. Thank you, Sven.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Beth, for these initial thoughts. We will go into more detail later. Let's continue with Adrian.
Thank you, Sven. Let me just share my slides. Okay, so I wanted to just focus on a key aspect that Emma and I wrote about in our book, which is really about maintaining perspective. And to me personally, in terms of developing well-being, not just teachers, but just generally as human beings, I just find it an underrated aspect of fostering good well-being, so much so that I included it in both of my books, and the chapter on teacher well-being in my first book, and then a whole chapter dedicated to it in the second book. So what is perspective? Perspective is really about how we see the world, how we see the events that happen to us and around us, and how we see things really matters. I'd just like to quote from a kind of few experts on this matter. So I've got a quote here from Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's famous for kind of bringing mindfulness to the West through his mindfulness-based stress reduction program. This comes from his book, Full Catastrophe Living. And comes from a chapter where he's talking about specifically about stress and how we relate to stressors in our lives. And he says it's not the stressors but how we perceive them, and in turn how we then handle them, that determines whether those stresses will lead to harmful stress. So it's, again, how we perceive the stresses in our lives that genuinely determine whether it leads to kind of us flourishing or lead to us floundering. Second quote comes from Matthieu Ricard, who's a Buddhist monk. And he says that happiness is also a way of interpreting the world, since while it may be difficult to change the world, it's always possible to change the way we look at it. And then finally, a quote from Ed Diener, who's one of the founding positive psychologists, says that it appears that the way people perceive the world is much more important to happiness than objective circumstances. So our perspective, our perception, how we see the world, it really, really does matter in terms of how we manage our stress levels, but also our kind of sense of pleasure and purpose in the world, how happy we feel, how content, our levels of well-being. Then there are some kind of practical aspects of perspective, and that is about what we pay attention to. This book by Professor Paul Dolan, who's a behavioural scientist expert at the London School of Economics, there's a quote that really kind of stood out from me in this book, and it's this one. It says, "Your happiness depends on what you pay attention to." And Paul Dolan says in his book, you know, this is as much about withdrawing your attention from the negative as it is about attending to the positive. And so, you know, Beth mentioned earlier, you know, when she's watching, say, the government briefings, and they can feel particularly overwhelming, you know, just the one yesterday where in the UK, you know, the day that we passed 100,000 deaths in the UK from coronavirus, you know, that is a particularly difficult government briefing to kind of sit through and watch. But we have a choice. We have agency, and I know Emma's going to be talking about this more. We have some control about what we pay attention to, and it's ultimately down to our choice whether we turn on the news, whether we turn on to that government briefing. We have choice about what we pay attention to. And this is particularly, it's not just government briefings. We really, really need to be mindful about our consumption of the news, because study after study shows that the news is not an accurate portrayal of what's happening in the world at all. It particularly goes to the things that stand out, the things that grab our attention. We have a negativity bias. This is an evolutionary hangover, which means we are drawn to, and we remember, and we pay attention typically to bad stuff more than good stuff. And this is because it was a survival mechanism for our ancestors. Our ancestors that could spot dangers quickly and avoid them, they survived and passed on their genes. So we have this innate bias to be drawn to the negative. And this is why the news particularly shares way more negative news stories than positive ones, because that's what we lap up. That's what we enjoy in a weird, perverse kind of way to pay attention to. A researcher called George Gerbner coined this expression, mean world syndrome, which was basically, his research showed the more that people consume the news, the more likely they are to agree with the statement, most people only care about themselves. And of course, we know that this is completely not true, that in you know, in natural disasters around the world, in moments of crisis, actually what happens with human behavior is that people rally around each other, people support one another, people are kind and helpful, and they help each other through difficult situations. And we're seeing it right now in the UK, around the world, NHS workers putting their lives on the line to look after, protect and save other people. So my plea is, for everyone, not just teachers, is be really mindful about what you pay attention to. Withdraw it from the things that are depleting you, they're draining you of energy, they're making you feel anxious and worried, and pay attention to the things that nourish you. It might be your friends, it might be your family, it might be the children in your classroom, be it in real life or over a Zoom chat, but pay attention to the things that make us feel good about being alive and that energize us and give us hope and optimism for the future. And the last thing I wanted to talk about, and this does come with a trigger warning because it is, you know, a focus on mortality. And Emma and I include some ideas from this book on the screen by Bronnie Ware. It's called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. Now, Bronnie Ware was a palliative care nurse in Australia, and she had the privileged position of caring for patients in the last few kind of weeks and days of their lives. And they would often open up to her and they'd share things that they were proud of. But a theme that kept recurring was people sharing their regrets, things that if they had their time differently, they wish they would do differently. And this reminded me, because I'm reading a book at the moment, it's called A Little History of Philosophy. And I just read a chapter from about the Stoics and Stoicism. And Stoicism and the Stoics say there's no point about lamenting what we cannot change. And they truly believe that a good life is about using your time wisely. And this is why Emma and I include these top 5 regrets in our book, because it really helps us to focus on what matters. And these are the top 5 regrets. 1, many people got to the end of their lives and wish they'd had the courage to lead a life true to themselves, you know, following their passions, their sense of purpose, their values, rather than leading lives that other people, maybe from pressure from parents, had wished them to lead. This is a cliche, but it's so important for teachers to realize this and senior leaders in schools. I wish I hadn't worked so hard. It's a cliche in the UK, you know, no one gets their deathbed and wishes they'd spent more time in the office or more time, you know, marking those books. I wish I'd had the courage to express my feelings. So this is about being, again, true to yourself. And this was in relation to people suppressing how they felt in order to appease other people. And on reflection, they wish they'd just be more honest about their feelings. I wish I'd had stayed in touch with my friends. You know, life gets busy, work takes over, family life, and suddenly we lose touch with people from school, from university, and we get to the end of our lives and realize actually those were really important relationships, and we wish we'd kind of invested in them more. And finally, many people got to the end of their life and said, I wish I'd let myself be happier. They realized that happiness, their well-being was a choice. They had more control than they thought they did. So I just wanted to kind of end again with a couple of quotes. One from Matthew Ricard, because it seems odd talking about kind of death when you're talking about well-being, but actually he says that accepting death as a part of life saves us from wasting our time on vain distractions. And I think in relation to teaching, the reason this resonates is because we spend, definitely in the UK, a lot of time on things that do not matter. And he says that someone who has used every second of her life to become a better person and to contribute to other people's happiness can die in peace. And I just think, and this is, you know, a change of perspective on this pandemic. Yes, this pandemic is wreaking havoc and destruction across the world. But equally, if we change the perspective, it's a real opportunity to stop how we're behaving, how we've been doing things in our lives generally, but particularly in education. I do think things need to change in our education system. There's far too much focus on extrinsic motivators like exam grades and things like that. Yes, they matter, but they don't matter as much as we've made them matter in the past. And this is an opportunity to stop, to step back and to reflect on what really matters. How do we want to use our precious time whilst we're alive? Let's spend it on the things that matter. Let's enrich the lives of teachers, our pupils and their families, because that's ultimately what really matters. So thank you, Sven, for letting me share those thoughts.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Adrian, for those really deep and positive thoughts. And with this, I would like to open the stage for Emma. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just going to start my slideshow. So we're really excited to have so many of you here from all over the world. I feel very privileged that you've given up your time to focus on your most precious resource, which is yourself. Well-being and looking after yourself has never been more challenging, but equally it has never been more important. And I feel really privileged to be able to share 2 key ideas from our book, A Little Guide to Teacher Wellbeing and Self-Care, with you today. Very briefly, just so you know who I am and why I'm speaking to you. I've been teaching for 23 years in the UK. I've written 2 books, one, How to Survive in Teaching, which looked at some of the challenges in the UK education system, as well as some of the ways forward, and looked at some positive models for how we look after and keep our best teachers in the classroom. And then, as you know, there is our recent book, which I've written with Adrian, and we are very proud of, very practical, research-based guide with lots and lots of things that you can take away and do very quickly and at no cost to help you with your well-being. So the 2 key ideas I would like to share are as follows, and these may not be new to you, but part of this is about actually giving you a reminder and giving yourself permission to look after yourself, because as Beth said, Self-care is not selfish, it is essential. So these concentric circles come from a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. And I find myself using these circles in all aspects of my life and my work, including when I'm working as a coach with individuals who are seeking to improve their lives. And what you've got here are 2 concentric circles. The inner circle is the circle of influence. Now, the circle of influence represents all of those things that are going on in your life, all of your priorities, all of your concerns, all of your issues, all of the things you're passionate about that really, really matter and over which you have some control. You might not have complete control, but you have some element of control. So a couple of examples. One is what you wear in the morning. And many of you, like me, will have spent the first lockdown of the pandemic mainly in pajamas before you decided that actually there was a reason to get up in the morning and there was a reason to reach out and support other people. And then after 3 weeks, I decided to get dressed and it made a difference. So I had control despite the fact that I imagined I didn't. I have control when I'm stressed and I'm tired over whether I listen to my husband and what he says to me or whether I go completely deaf to him and ignore everything he says. I do have control over that. I might imagine I don't, but I do. I have control over what I put into my body, food, drink, and so on. So the circle of influence is all the things you have control over. Let's turn our attention now to the circle of control. The circle of concern, apologies. The circle of concern represents all of the things going on around us, which cause us anxiety, concern, which take up our energy, over which we have no control. Now let's think about the context for a moment. We are in a pandemic. The pandemic has affected the whole world by definition. That's what a pandemic is. And there are so many things going on. So I haven't seen my own parents for a very long time. I'm very worried about them. I really miss them. I have no control over that. I have no control over whether our government chooses to make an announcement about reopening schools on New Year's Eve. I have no control over that. I have no control on a different level over what other people think of me. So you might fail to say good morning to me. You might walk past me and look at me in such a way as if you're having a bad day, and I might think I've done something wrong, but it might just be what's going on in your life. So you can do an exercise with this, and we won't do it now, but I'll leave it with you, where you draw 2 circles on a page and you start to write down all of the things, all of the noise in your head. You start to write it down and you say to yourself, is this within my circle of influence? Can I influence some element of, for example, my workload? Is there somebody I could speak to? Could I delegate this? Is there something I can control? Could I phone this parent? And you start to gain some control over what can feel quite overwhelming. And the simple act of writing things down in itself is hugely powerful, but what you're doing is you're creating boundaries. The second concept I'd like to share with you is my current favorite concept, and it's the concept of otherishness. Now, this is not a word, you won't find this word in the Oxford English Dictionary. This is a term that has been coined by Professor Adam Grant. And Professor Adam Grant works with missions and looks at how people work together efficiently and effectively. And he has come up with 2 ideas. The first is the idea of selfless giving. So selfless giving is quite common in teaching. So we are naturally giving people. Beth mentioned this as well. And then there are otherish givers. So what's the difference? Well, selfless givers are a bit like this, and you will recognize these people from your staff room. If you're a teacher, think about your staff room now. And let's imagine somebody in the staff room. Let's call her Bertha. Bertha is amazing. She's really talented. She's warm. She's kind. She's passionate about teaching. And Bertha gives almost regardless. So if you can ask Bertha to do anything, to help you with your lesson planning, to soothe a child who's crying, to go on an extra school trip, and she will do it. But Bertha can be quite easily taken advantage of because people will often say, well, ask Bertha, ask Bertha. And after a while, Bertha starts to get really tired. And she might start to resent all this giving as she gets more and more and more tired. And Bertha is less likely to remain in the teaching profession. As you may be aware, we lose 33% of our teachers within the first 5 years of their career. So Bertha is at high risk of walking away. So let's have a look at otherish givers. Now, firstly, important, otherish givers are still very generous people. They still want to make a difference. They're not selfish. But what they do is they give with a clear sense of purpose. Does this matter to our young people? Or am I just doing it as a paper exercise? Will this help with my career? Will this help with my networks? Will this link me with interesting and inspiring people? Selfless givers have clear boundaries and they know when to say no. In England, we are not very good at saying no. We are excessively polite at times. And we sometimes say yes and we don't mean it. And then we regret it later. Otherish givers know when to say, actually, I'm really tired today. I can't do this. I'll do that for you tomorrow. I'll do it next week. Or I need time with my family. It's Saturday. I don't work on a Saturday. And they will say that. They'll be very clear, very polite, but they will be absolutely in no doubt that that is their time for themselves and their family. Most importantly, and finally from me, otherish givers give in a way that is sustainable. So we have a problem with keeping teachers in this country. And I know it's a problem in many other countries as well. But if you give in an otherish way, you are more likely to stay in the profession. And we need you more than ever as people who are on the internet on a Wednesday evening to stay in this profession. So thank you. That's it from me. And that's where you can find me. And I will hand back to Sven.
Thank you very much, Emma. According to the Teacher Wellbeing Index, 42% of education professionals stated that their organization either did not have or were unsure if they had a well-being policy. Adrian, are we still far from prioritizing the mental health of our teachers? And if so, why do you think this is like this?
Yeah, I do think things are heading in a better direction. I think, you know, understandably, most of the focus in schools is on children and, you know, children's academic learning and now there's a greater focus on children's mental health and well-being, but that's often to the detriment of teachers' mental health and well-being. There isn't as great a focus on that, you know, and you know, if teachers aren't well mentally, physically, then they're not going to be able to be good teachers for their students. They're not going to be able to emotionally support their students. And there's also something called emotion contagion, which is, you know, moods, emotions are contagious. If your teacher is stressed, it's likely to kind of bleed out into the classroom as well. So yeah, we focus more on children than we do on teachers. There are certain changes in England, I think, that are happening that are positive. So there's been a national supervision hub that's been set up at Leeds Beckett University to provide supervision for senior leaders in schools and teachers. There's the Department for Education has said that they're going to commit to creating a wellbeing charter where they want schools to measure staff wellbeing and kind of, like Beth said, track it and make sure that interventions and support is having the impact. There's DFE in the UK has been doing a lot of work around kind of workload reduction. So the things are heading in the right direction. However, what I would say is that I think that the kind of actions speak louder than words, and we're not seeing kind of real concrete things change in schools kind of quick enough. So yeah, we need the actions to kind of catch up with the rhetoric and the words that we're hearing from politicians and education secretaries and things. And we need change on the ground. There's too much emphasis on academic attainment, and all of the pressure and focus that brings means teachers' well-being is not high on the agenda in lots of institutions. In many schools, they're doing fantastic jobs on this front, but in too many, it's just not prioritized enough.
Yeah. Emma, and taking this point a little bit that we still have to improve. In your book you wrote with Adrian, you say that well-being is essential to effective teaching. In a way, happy teachers teach better. So what has to be done to put well-being at the heart of our schools, and what tools are needed from your perspective?
So I think it's really important to emphasize that well-being isn't something extra that we need to do in schools. So I met a head teacher not long ago in a lovely school in Cambridgeshire, and she said, but we're not doing anything for well-being. And I said to her, but are your staff happy? You know, do they come to the staff room? Do they stay? Do they stay in your school? She said, well, yes. So you don't need to do anything. There is a misconception in schools that we need to do stuff. And there we have come across examples, Adrian and I, of things like compulsory yoga on a Friday after school. Now, yoga's great, but it's not my cup of tea, and I don't want to actually be doing it with my line manager on a Friday when I could be with my family. So we've got this idea that it's something extra. It's integral to everything we do. We've also got, there's a misconception that well-being is about maybe being a bit lazy. I don't want to do my marking. I don't want to plan my lessons. There is no such thing as a lazy teacher, or if there is, they don't last very long. Teachers do not go into the job for an easy life. And I think where well-being comes in is with that sense of professional integrity. There is no greater sense of well-being than coming home from work thinking, I've done a really good job today. My voice has been heard. I've made a difference to this community of young people. And finally, for me, I'd say, you know, you quoted the Teacher Wellbeing Index from Education Support. That's been running for 3 years, and it has found year upon year that there is a stigma in UK schools about talking about struggling with our mental health specifically. That there is a perception that if you say, I am anxious, I am depressed, people will think you're a bad teacher. And we need to overcome this. Things are, like Adrian says, things are moving in the right direction. I think we've just tipped, it's less than 50% now of teachers who say that they think they would be negatively perceived if they say they're struggling, but there's still almost half of teachers. So it's about leadership, modeling vulnerability and modeling struggling and making it okay not to be okay.
Yeah. Talking about this leadership role, Beth, you're the group director of well-being at Cognita. What is your role, and how do you support individual schools and teachers within your group?
Well, it's a good question. It's a great role, and you know, I suppose initially, you know, you've got nearly 10,000 teachers in 10 different countries and 80,000 students, and it can be a bit overwhelming. And I sort of really saw myself as a well-being conduit. But before we were able to do that, that's why I keep talking about this definition. The first thing was about making it less nebulous, making it clear so everybody that you would speak to in our schools would know what well-being is and what things they need to do to improve it. Once they knew that, then it was easier to start packing down and thinking, okay, well, now we know what these things are. What are we doing as a school to, you know, strengthen or contribute to these things on a staff level, on a student level, and on a family level? And I think so that was sort of that clarity was one of the first things. The second part is about really trying to unify the passion and commitment to well-being across our schools and countries and regions. And I think this is a passion that you'll see in all educators. In fact, I think it's educators who are driving the well-being agenda with governments and beyond. It's coming from teachers recognizing that why on earth isn't this higher up the agenda? Why is it seen as a separate? So, you know, I've got a really nice job in that sense in really trying to pull it together to embed this culture of well-being in our schools. So progressing it, as Adrian was saying, beyond conversation to actually a culture. And so by pulling together these people, we really are getting a feeling or benefiting, I suppose, from the collective brilliance of all of them. And by pushing on with the evidence, and teachers are really busy and have 1,000,001 things to do. So, you know, it's not for them, I guess, to be searching up for the evidence to support why they should sleep better. That's part of my role as well. And finally, the role is to share any benefit we get from being part of a group of colleagues to all students. You know, children are children no matter where they are, and their well-being counts. So that's another sort of part of it is sharing it with whoever it would be useful for. And that's why all our resources or anything like that, they're just open source for anybody to use. And then you asked me about how that happens, how I support it. Again, I think we've touched on it, that it has to be everyone's job, really moving away from, who's the wellbeing lead in your school? You've got one person who's trying to do staff wellbeing, baking brownies on a Friday, and they're trying to run PSHE, and they're trying to do everything else. And I think, again, going back to, once you know what you're talking about, you can say, well, okay, who can contribute to diet and exercise? That might be conversations with the canteen, it might be the vending machine people. Who can talk about connecting, doing and giving are our mental contributors. So anybody in school can help with those sorts of things. So really broadening it out to say that it's everyone's responsibility, not someone's job. A little bit like with safeguarding, which I think has just come in leaps and bounds in the last 10 years. And now that is really embedded in schools. If we could have that sort of approach with well-being, that would be fantastic. I think sharing, as I said, our experience with each other and celebrating all the great things that are going on. And the celebrating is important because for far too long, teachers have been doing all these extra bits to improve student well-being and their colleagues' well-being just because they knew it was important. And it's important to call it out, I think, as a leader and as somebody in my role, to say, look at what they're doing there. That's amazing. That's making such an effort, an impact on that child or that family. So, and then it becomes important and it goes up the sort of status ladder. We've had lots of sort of examples of that, and it feeds back to that giving as well, that we know is so good for our mental well-being.
Yeah, I really like what you're saying, right? So it's not about one well-being person, although it probably really helps in your organization to have somebody who can push out the importance of the topic. But at the end of the day, it has to be culture in a school, right? Everyone, as you said, everyone is responsible. Adrian, in this context, what are the key aspects of a meaningful school well-being policy? I mean, how can we come to this point that really well-being is on top of the school leadership team's agenda, that everybody feels free to speak up if he or she has problems, and feels comfortable in asking for help?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I'd say. I think it's way more important, like Beth says, to have a culture, and like Emma said, that well-being isn't this kind of add-on, bolt-on thing, that well-being is just part of the culture of the school, because you can have the best well-being policy, but like most policies in schools, they're often not read by teachers, and it's about these cultures being lived and breathed by staff. And it also, you can't have an amazing well-being policy which is then undermined by your feedback and marking policy, which gets you to mark a piece of work 3 times before it's kind of submitted, or a behavior policy that kind of isn't supportive of teachers. So every kind of policy has to support well-being. Having said that, in terms of a well-being policy, I would say that ultimately has to start and be led by the overall aim, vision, ethos of the school, which must have well-being at its heart. So, for example, my school are recruiting for a new teacher, and the very first line of the job advert says, "We believe that happier teachers teach better and happier pupils learn better," because our school just believes that the happiness and well-being of the people in our community is the most important thing, and everything kind of springs from that. Other things, give as much time out of class as you feasibly can in a school. So in our school, we've got double planning time compared to what, we should be given via statutory kind of rules. You need communication protocols. So you need to be stating clearly when staff can and cannot be contacted, when they should be expected to reply to emails, things like that. We shouldn't be having staff contacted all throughout the evening and being expected to reply to parents and senior leaders. You should have activities that provided that support and encourage good mental health and well-being. These, like Emma said, should be offered on a voluntary basis. So yes, you can have a yoga teacher that comes in like I did at a previous school, which you can join if you want to. could have mindfulness classes, gym, subsidized gym, healthy lunches, whatever. But you're encouraging staff to be healthy by providing it, but you can't force them to do it. Extra support when needed. It might be access to counselling services, supervision, flexible working. So can teachers do their planning and marking at home? Do they have to be in the school building? I know some schools have late starts for family occasions. So if you're a teacher and you never ever get to take your own child to their Christmas performance, but you then have to be for 30 kids that aren't your own kids' Christmas performance, it doesn't quite make sense. And can you give time off in lieu when staff give over and above and do, residential trips where they're away from their own families? Can they have some time back for that? Beth said this: staff wellbeing surveys, you need to monitor it, you need to track it, you need to treasure what you measure and measure what you treasure. And finally, I think you need like Beth said again, a staff wellbeing team, a staff wellbeing committee, a cross-section of staff across the school that their remit is to listen to their colleagues and work on and be empowered to make life better for staff in that school.
It really sounds like a lot of common sense, right? That doesn't mean that it's easy to do, but
No.
at the end of the day, I think you're absolutely right. Emma, do schools have sufficient support from the governments, or can we improve on that front? Your mic is off.
I swore I wouldn't get political. I won't. No, in the UK, schools do not have sufficient support from the government, and nor have they in the 23 years that I've been teaching. So regardless of which government, there is something relatively unique about the UK, which I don't see so much in France or Germany, for example, where education is often treated like a political football, and changes are made with each new government, with each new leader, anyway, outside the pandemic. And so I've seen so many changes for the sake of changes. We will change completely how German is taught at Key Stage 3, go away, rewrite everything you've already written. And that's happened over the years that I've been teaching repeatedly. So we're learning new curricula, new content, new principles. During the pandemic, let's just put this into perspective. I am seriously worried about the well-being of school leaders at the moment. School leaders have not had a break for nearly a year now. So every important government announcement has been made on a weekend or during a holiday. So there has been no time for head teachers to switch off at all. I know it's been tough for teachers as well. I think the way that the changes have been communicated has been shocking. Absolutely shocking, to the point where I worry that head teachers will start leaving the profession because of how they feel treated by the government. I'm genuinely worried about that. And they don't feel listened to. So what we get in the UK is almost the battle between the unions, who are trying to protect staff's health, essentially, and the media. And then you get, these inflammatory headlines which say, please let our teachers be heroes, they just want to go to work, when actually it's not that simple, and it's not that black and white at all. So in answer to your question, no, I do not feel that the government is supporting the teaching profession as it needs to be in this country. And I fear, and I am an optimist, but I fear that we are going to see the effects of that on retention of all school staff, but particularly of school leadership.
So extending the view a little bit globally, Beth, Cognita has schools in Europe, Latin America, and Asia, across different regions and cultures. Does teacher well-being has the same meaning, or do you see differences? And how do you adapt your way you're working with teachers in different regions?
Well, it's amazing. I think if I had been given the role of any other aspect of school life and trying to pull it across all those cultures, it would have been a complete nightmare, and I would have been the antidote of well-being. But actually, it is remarkably similar. So as soon as we had that definition, and understanding of those 6 contributors, the recognition from all regions without fail was the same. And interestingly, also the things that threatened well-being. And we had a Global Be Well Day, which is our annual focus day on on well-being and all things to do with well-being. And after that, we always follow up with some questions just to see sort of what things they are concerned about. And in the survey we did last year, every single top 2 things that threatened it, they were social media and screen time in all regions. It was staggering. So I think that the things that contribute to well-being and the things that threaten it are really similar across the group. And whilst the topics are similar, you have to adapt them slightly for cultural reasons. So, for example, one of our teachers wrote a really lovely book about Sleepy Simon, and we sent it over to our age group. I said, "Is this any good for your guys to read to the little ones?" And things that I hadn't even thought about, and they said, "Yes, great, I really like it, but there's no point in having a dog because we have no dogs in where it was. We don't have a flat. Their flats not gardens. They don't know what a washing line is. There are all these little things, but the important stuff was the same. It was just all the other little things, the contextual things. So I think that's really reassuring to know. I think the framework therefore is the same, and the strategic priority is the same. So in any school, well-being will be on the strategic agenda, and it's encouraged to be on the individual. As I said, we call it Let's Talk, but different people, it'd be performance management or appraisals is there, because if it's not there, it'll just slip by and get edged out by the next government initiative or whatever else it is. So I think the measurement way, we have a voice of the server, voice of the student, voice of the employee, and voice of the parent, and that is the same, but that's an annual measurement. And now we're exploring more in-depth ways of measuring across the group things like sleep or the actual contributors. So I think the policies will be different. The framework will be the same. The actual little policies will be slightly different. But I think that the key messages in terms of how you lead on this is you lead by example. Some Adrian and Emma have mentioned there's no good, if you never see your children, in their Christmas play, whereas if you lead and you actually give that message, that's important. You can start small. I think that's another message we say. It doesn't have to, I'm going to do all 6 contributors. You can start small. But to give some examples, because sometimes the caretaker might think, well, how on earth am I going to contribute to well-being? And actually what you're asking them to do is, as the children come in, you say, right, come on, 5 squats with me, or whatever, if you're encouraging exercise. So you do need to give some examples to start the discussion. But then teachers and everyone I've ever met that works with educators, as soon as you give them that nugget, off they go and they can run with it. And it's about integrating it, not on top of or an extra, as Emma said.
Yeah. Going back to the individual level, according to the Teacher Wellbeing Index we have already mentioned before, 1/3 of education professionals would turn to somebody outside of work first if they experience mental health issues at work. We mentioned that before, right? So that you need this trust. So Beth, what do you think, which barriers are teachers facing when reporting mental health issues, and how could schools do a better job to create that trust?
I think, first of all, the good news is that they have turned to somebody. So, that perhaps the message is getting out there, even if it's not in schools, it is good to share with somebody. But I think when we look at barriers, we need to think of actual barriers and then presumed barriers. And both of them are a concern, actually, because if we look at stigma, if this is an issue in your organisation, then that is a real problem. But equally, if it's not an issue at all for you, really, but people think it's an issue, then that's also, something that needs addressing. So assuming or making assumptions about things that are and aren't barriers is dangerous. And I think we have to start asking and talking to find out what people might think are barriers. And sometimes, when you are leading, you just assume that everybody comes with you and assume that they know that you think it's fine to talk, and maybe we need to be a bit more open. So the openness of a culture, a lack of education, and I don't mean just having the odd poster up here and there, but really compelling evidence that I've spoken about well-being, and the fact that you've given it time in staff training, or you've given it time, you've given people the afternoon off to go and exercise. You know, I'm saying afternoon off where that's possible, so that they can see that they've been given time to think about it, because one of the biggest problems teachers face is a lack of time. And they're on this treadmill, so they often don't even get time to think or recognize that they're just on autopilot. So actually stepping back and saying, we do care about this, here's some time where I actually want you to think about what's good for your well-being, tells you that it's important. Other issues could be things like clarity about the support that is and isn't available. Do they know where they can go? The role modeling I've spoken about, and also the opportunity, giving opportunities, not just in a formal setting, but perhaps also making informal opportunities for, for colleagues to go for a walk and talk. It's sometimes a bit intense if the only time you get to express a problem is across the desk to your head teacher, where you feel like you're in a therapy room or in an interview. In fact, the last time you probably were in that room was it for your interview. So making informal and formal opportunities, I think, is one way that we can really try and change that area, so that sort of space. I think practical things like the actual spaces in your school, not just for talking, but some staff rooms are like a goldfish bowl, when kids are sort of looking in, and are there actual areas for people to unwind? Are there showers? If you're saying exercise is really important, you're encouraging people to come in, is there somewhere where they can get changed, or are they sort of doing it in the locking their door and doing it in the cupboard? Is there is there an opportunity for them to have breakfast if they do come in early, or they cycle early, so I think if you take those the things that are important to mental health and think about how you can contribute to them in your school, that certainly might help. And then finally, I would say be really public and proud about it to your students and family and staff, because sometimes, again, that assuming that staff know it's fine to come in early and have a shower in the PE room after their workout, but maybe they don't know that, so make it really implicit. And then finally, I would say just couple it with empowering people, your community members, to identify in themselves possible solutions, because I think sometimes head teachers would be really open to suggestions that a colleague might make. So for example, you might think, well, I'm really stressed. That last period of the day is so stressful because I can never get to my child's nursery to pick him up on time if the traffic is bad. You're stressed all day. The lesson, invariably things go wrong with it. Maybe speaking to your head teacher and say, look, I'm really struggling on this day. Is there any chance that somebody just come and cover the last 5 minutes? It would make the world of difference to me. The head teacher is never going to be able to predict that that's a solution. You need to come up with some of these things yourself, and more often than not, I think heads are really grateful for that. So having the confidence, if the environment is right, to suggest some opportunities to make your well-being better. Hopefully that will help some of the progress.
Great, thank you very much. Before we come to the Q&A, maybe Adrian and Emma, I would like to touch the point on teacher training. Are we preparing our teachers, especially our young teachers, before they get started with teaching sufficiently in these issues of well-being?
I would say no. I would say it's kind of, in the UK, it's hit and miss. So some teacher training organisations are really good on this, and they will have speakers come in, and they'll have units on mental health and well-being, so that they are trained in knowing how to look after their own mental health and well-being and that of students, and that's the ideal as far as I'm concerned. But I was invited to a Department for Education roundtable discussion about teacher well-being, and this was to inform the early career framework. So this new framework was being put around new teachers, and the focus was well-being. And the very first thing I did when I got the draft of this document was just search well-being, search mental health mental health didn't come up at all, and well-being came up once, and literally it was one bullet point in this whole 6-page document that said trainee teachers need to find time to rest and recover, and that was it. And my point was, well, how, we need to teach young teachers how to do that. Like, experienced teachers have learned the hard way how to find, how to make it work, and that's how they've made it sustainable. A bit like Emma said, it's, I think, largely through learning how to be more otherish. So no, we need to explicitly teach trainee teachers, and actually more experienced teachers as well, the science of well-being, because I know that is what Beth brings into her role. When you teach about the science of, say, sleep, and that there is a science behind this, let's share that with people, because it's not common knowledge, and it's certainly not common action. So yeah, there should be whole units, modules, not just a one-off, a mindfulness taster session or something like that. A whole unit or module dedicated to what does the science of well-being shows contributes to well-being. How can we apply that to our own lives and model it as teachers, and how can we develop it in our students?
I think I would echo what Adrian says. It's hit and miss. There is some superb work happening in teacher training organisations. I think the early career framework has developed to take on more elements of teacher well-being from the last time I looked at it. But it ultimately comes down to role models. So our trainee teachers are in schools. And I met a teacher not very long ago who didn't finish her teacher training. And her words were, "I did not want to be as stressed and miserable as my mentor." So what we are modeling to our trainees, we have to be very, very careful, because we can all fall into the trap of saying in October, "Oh, you think you're tired now? Wait till Christmas." Or, "Oh, goodness me, well, if you can't cope with a bad lesson observation, then you're not going to cope with Ofsted coming." So we have to be very, very mindful of the messages. So actually, this comes down to how we train our mentors, how we work with our mentors, how we support our mentors, how we support the schools in their support of trainees. So there's a much bigger picture there than necessarily just the training, the picturing the training organization, if that makes sense. We need to be beware of modeling presenteeism, the culture of being seen to work more hours than is necessary. And we need to show our trainees that you can stop working at 5 o'clock. You can put your out of office on. You can say no if somebody asks you something unreasonable. Those healthy levels of rebellion that we can model to our trainees.
Perfect. Thank you very much for sharing so openly your insights with our audience. Before we go to Q&A, very quickly, we always love to be very hands-on. So we'd like to ask you for one idea, just one sentence we can give to the audience, what everybody of us could do Monday morning or tomorrow morning at our school to improve our colleagues' well-being. Beth, you want to go?
Okay, sure. I think I'm going to go really simple, and I would just say smile, and just try and think of one little positive thing that you can do to improve someone else's day. I love William Shakespeare's quote, said that the rob that smiles steals something from the thief. And I think that any time somebody really smiles at you, no matter how bad a day you're having, a really nice smile, you just leave a little tiny bit feeling a little tiny bit better. So big smile, and if there's something little you can do, that will have this positive ripple effect of a culture of kindness and giving.
Thank you very much. Adrian.
Yeah, I mean, I probably would have said something along of smile or try and have a laugh with your colleague. But I would just say, just have a chat, make the time to have a conversation. And even if that conversation is a difficult one, maybe that colleague is going through a tough time or whatever, but literally just give each other your full attention and just connect and just listen to each other, share, show your humanity to one another, and just let each other know that you're there for one another, because that's ultimately what gets us through tough times, is other people.
There's some lovely ideas coming on the chat. I'm going to go with 3 good things. This is something Adrian and I share and is consistently really popular, really simple. End of each day, sit down and write down 3 good things that have happened to you, whether you've had a fresh coffee in the morning, whether a parent has phoned you to say thank you for supporting their child, whether a child has made you laugh, whatever it is, write them down, and it helps you to rewire your brain, as Rick Hansen says, towards the positive.
Thank you very much. I think if we follow those advices, tomorrow will be a little bit better day. With this, I would like to hand over to Christina to share with us some of the questions from our audience.
Good evening. There were several questions in the chat and in the Q&A. The first one goes for Emma. How can we help our team to build boundaries? Shall we set them up together with them?
Helping your team to draw boundaries between work and home. So
yeah.
I assume this is a leader of a team. So as Adrian said earlier, behavior is contagious. So if you as a leader are walking into school with 16 bags in the morning, running around all day looking stressed, then your team who will admire you, who will be very fond of you, will think that's how they need to be working in order to be effective. So you need them to see you leaving to take your child swimming, or just take yourself swimming at 4 o'clock at least one day a week. So you need to be modeling it. Explicitly spend time in meetings sharing good practice around prioritizing. So linked to an earlier question, I've never been taught how to manage my workload. I'm still learning. I'm 47, I'm still learning. Actually taking the time to say this strategy, the Eisenhower matrix, important, urgent, etc., the matrix, that's really useful. The Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, where you make your list, choose the 2 things that will make the most difference to you in a day. So take time when you're meeting with your team to talk about them, and be willing to be honest about your own struggles. If you're leading a team, if you can they will think you're amazing. They will think you're superhuman. And if you can humanize yourself and talk about times when you've struggled and what you've learned, then that will be extremely powerful as well.
Wow, thank you. Very nice advice. Thank you. That one goes for Beth. Beth, is there any resource to measure well-being? Did you build it yourselves, or is there any resource there?
Yeah, look, there were lots of different options. I think going back to, you've got to drill down a little bit into well-being, because sometimes it gets confused with safeguarding, and you get questions that are asking, do you feel safe in school? And they're all really important questions, but they also create a lot of work straight away, because if somebody says no, you have to have the systems to follow it up. So if you think, well, let's just start small, because I think it can be really overwhelming to think of all these things. Let's just say we are going to measure sleep. We're just going to ask about sleep. You could do it as simply as you have if some of you use Teams, I'm sure lots of schools do. There's a happy sad face as you come in. There are different apps that you can just did you sleep well? Yes, no, and you could do that at different times of the day. Let's say there's not specific data, so it's not saying little Johnny didn't sleep well, but you're saying, oh, look at this, 80% of our kids are not going to bed until 11 or not sleeping well. So there are simple things like that. We use AS tracking, which is a tool that measures biases. So this is a more predictive, a more in-depth, so it's not sort of instant, how do you feel? It's actually looking at the sort of biases that children might have that would cause problems in the future. So for example, it looks at if they are very trusting of other people, that might mean that they get taken advantage of. So if you could pick that up early, you can then think, well, look, little Johnny again is very trusting of other people. We'll have some conversations with him about being a little bit more careful with his information and those sorts of things. And then I think those are sort of just a very complex one and a really simple one. that we have used thus far. There are a number of our schools that use some individual ones that I could give you the details of afterwards, if that helps.
Please do so, because we will add it to the resource, to the report that we are going to build after. Thank you. Adrian, given the situation that we are living today, how many teaching hours would then be reasonable? Nice questions, eh?
Yeah, well, Emma and I cite research in a book, I think it comes from Harvard University or a university in America, that basically shows after about roughly 50 hours a week, productivity literally just falls off a cliff edge. Like we become significantly less productive after about 50 hours a week, and then over 60, I think we start going backwards. We start to, like, you know, really doing ourselves and our workload harm. I would say personally, I think what matters most, more than number of hours, is whether the work feels meaningful and purposeful. Because I honestly don't think about the number of hours that I work now, and I often work in the evening now, partly because we're trying to homeschool my wife and I in the day, and you know, I've still got work to do, so I then sit down and do it in the evening. The reason I don't resent that is because my work feels purposeful and meaningful. Like I partly enjoy doing it, even though stuff I don't enjoy, I think this is important. That what gets people down, and what got me down as a teacher in certain schools, was when I was doing work that I just thought, this is pointless. This is not positively impacting my students. It's detrimental to my health and well-being because I'm frustrated and I'm tired and I'm stressed. So that's what I would say is most important. If the work isn't enjoyable and it's not meaningful, I would say push back and say, I'm not doing this. There is no point to this piece of work. And I mean that. I'm not just saying that. That is what I would say to my senior leaders, and have those difficult conversations, because it's worth it in the long run.
Can I just jump in there, because
Yeah, sure.
I know I keep talking about sleep, and you must think I'm on commission by some sort of sleep scientist. I'm really not, but I think as soon as it starts impacting sleep, you have to address that straight away, because the more deeply entrenched sleep problems become, the harder they are to unpick. And really, it's just it's just a ticking time bomb. So if you're struggling to sleep, address it immediately. And there are some things you could do, and one of them does include switching off earlier than just before you go to bed. But I think that is such a priority. So if you're just going to prioritize one thing, look at sleep. Obviously, other things about movement and exercise, especially when we're at home schooling, is another one. But if you start off with the things that are really important for your well-being first, you put them in. If they're getting pushed out to such a degree that you're not sleeping well, then you need to go and have some conversations about what needs to shift.
Thank you. Emma, do you want to add anything to this, because we are now finishing? Can you the mic, please?
Again, sorry. Different things work for different people, but I would say have at least one day in the weekend when you do not think about work of any kind at all.
This goes for everybody, not only for teachers, right?
For everybody, yes. Ideally 2 days in the weekend where you don't think about work at all.
Thank you very much. That's all then for today. Sven?
Perfect. So yeah, I think this was a really interesting discussion. We touched upon a lot of points. We started off with Beth talking about reframing self-compassion and well-being, not as selfish, but as something that is essential. We talked about we have to define what we understand under well-being. What are the influencers? Be really clear about that, then communicate it to the organization and perceive well-being not as a role of somebody, but as a culture. And we also talked that celebrating success is important in that context. Then Adrian talked about getting the right perspective, paying attention to the things that are really important and seeing the big picture. And I really liked your comment when you said it's much more important to have a culture that integrates well-being than any well-being policy. And that well-being probably shouldn't have even a well-being policy, but just make sure that well-being is supported by all other policies. And then that's probably the way that we get it done. And Emma shared that we should focus on controlling what we can, be more otherish. I didn't know that concept, but I liked it. So we definitely learned something today. And that we really need to share our problems, right? When we have problems, find this colleague to have a talk and open up. Don't leave it eat you up from the inside. And then we shared some tips for tomorrow morning. So go to work smiling, do this one little positive thing that is impacting somebody else. Be open to have that conversation that might be very, very useful for your colleague, and practice a little bit of gratitude. Write down at the end of the day the 3 good things that happened to you. So I think the 3 good things that happened to us were our 3 speakers today. Thank you very much, Beth, Emma, and Adrian.
Lovely to be here.
And before we close, I just would like to draw your attention to our next event next month on the 24th of February. We talk about special needs and technology. So how technology can help teaching students with special educational needs. Thank you very much for everybody for joining us tonight. And you will get the report in the next couple of days in your inbox. And we hope that this was an interesting event for you. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you very much and have a good evening, everybody. Goodbye.